Okay. All set, Erica?
All set. Take it away, Darlene.
Thank you so much, Erica, and hello, everyone. And thank you for joining us for this year's first webinar for the Collections Care and Conservation Alliance, titled Deaccessioning: The Deeper Dive. My name is Darlene Bialowski, and I am the president of the Collections Care and Conservation Alliance, as well as a contract museum registrar and a fine and decorative arts appraiser here in Southwest New Hampshire. It's with a bit of regret this afternoon that I was informed Matt Powers, the executive director of the Woodstock History Center, is going to be unable to join us. Matt is homesick, but he has sent me his notes, which I will do the best to convey. And he expressed that he will be joining us next week for the conversations with colleagues. So he'll be available at that time to answer any of your questions with specificity to what I will share from his notes today, and any questions you might have from his Deaccessioning 101 webinar that he presented for the Collections Care Alliance back in December of 2021. So that's next week, next Wednesday, the 29th at 12 noon. And I'll have a reminder for you at the end of the webinar as well. A little housekeeping, if you wouldn't mind putting yourselves on mute until you're ready to ask a question or make a comment later on. It just helps with the distraction of presenters and anyone else who's asking a question at the time. So we do appreciate that. If you are familiar with the Collections Care and Conservation Alliance, I apologize for any repetition, but if you're new to joining us, the Collections Care and Conservation Alliance, or CCCA as we fondly call it, is a nonprofit established in Vermont in 2019. And we are a group founded by 13 professionals who come from the fields of archives work, object-based collections work, and conservation. Our mission is threefold. We serve as a resource for networking, professional development, and educational opportunities for our colleagues who work in small museums, archives, libraries, all kinds of cultural repositories. The second fold is to help the volunteers who work in those same types of institutions, but might not have the professional background for support. Our third fold of our resources that we make available are for the general public, those who buy and collect things and those who inherit things and might want to learn a little bit more about what they have and how to take care of things. Our website, which Erica will throw into the chat for you, has a lot of information about past and upcoming events, biographies of board members, and you have several of them on the call today, including myself. And you'll find categories of membership and the criteria for eligibility of both of those. There is also a category for friend if someone just wishes to donate to support the organization, which is fully staffed by volunteers, and everything that we take in as income goes back to supporting the organization and the work that we do. As I mentioned, we have this event called Conversations with Colleagues, which is generally a benefit of being a professional affiliate member of the CCCA. But when we started offering virtual events, we added this component in the week following the presentation to give people time to really review and assess all the material they may have gotten in the presentation, to ask some upcoming questions, for the presenters to have an opportunity to add something more in that they didn't have a chance to do, and for just people to network and have the ability to chat about things particular to the topic in that conversation with other individuals who are on the call. Again, Matt will be present next week, so if you do have specific questions for him, just make note of them, and please join us next week. I think you will be very happy that you did. The link to today's event will be emailed you shortly thereafter. And the conversations with colleagues are not recorded, so there won't be anything to be received after that. So again, an encouragement to join us. So now I'd like to introduce you to two of our speakers for today. And the first we have is Rejoice Sherry, who is a Historic Sites Regional Administrator with the Vermont Division of Historic Preservation. She assumed this role in May of 2022 and currently oversees the preservation and operation of two Vermont State Historic Sites, the President Calvin Coolidge State Historic Site in Plymouth and the Old Constitution House in Windsor. Rejoice's resume includes an impressive list of internships at institutions such as the Yeager Museum of Art and Culture at Hartwick College, the National Archives at the Franklin D. Roosevelt Presidential Library, and the Pittsburgh Symphony Orchestra Archives. She chose to follow a career in historic preservation after discovering previously unknown original documents relating to the Culper spy ring of the American Revolution at the FDR Library. Following graduation from the University of Pittsburgh's archival program with a Master's of Library and Information Science, Rejoice was first employed at the university as the university archivist at Delaware State University in Dover, Delaware. She then briefly served as the director of the Arthur A. Houghton Library at SUNY Corning Community College before accepting her current role. We also have with us today Steve Perkins, a lifelong Vermonter whose professional career has led him on a path of preserving and celebrating Vermont's unique history and iconic landscape. Steve lives in his family's 1805 farmhouse in northern Vermont and is inspired by the landscape and history surrounding him each day. He left Vermont with the intention of not returning in order to pursue a career in historic preservation. After undergraduate studies in historic preservation, art history, and theater, Steve finished his studies with a degree in early American material culture from the Winter program at the University of Delaware. After brief stints at Hampton National Historic Site and Winter Museum, Steve returned to Vermont with his wife Galen and took up residency in Bennington. Here he served as the curator and then director of the Bennington Museum. With an ill father to tend to and the need for a change, Steve moved home to Williston, purchased the family farm, and joined the staff of ECHO. Since 2015, Steve has been the executive director of the Vermont Historical Society. So Rejoice, let me turn it over to you.
All right, great. So I'm just going to share my screen quickly. Hello. There we go. Is that good? Everybody can see it? Perfect. Okay. Well, I'm honored to speak today, but I haven't actually achieved anything in deaccessioning as yet. So I'm here more to offer you a glimpse into the start of my project, which, if anything, is more about intellectual rather than physical labor at this point. So I'm just going to walk you through my thought processes occurring at square one and hopefully set the scene for my colleagues to take it from there. So my role as site administrator at the Coolidge Historic Site is a career change for me, as you heard. I have a library science degree, but everything that I do now as curator is still filtered through my paper-based background in archival practices. So when I'm examining artifacts, my internal dialogue is very much colored by my understanding of informational values. What stories do objects tell? How can I use that object as a launching point to convey information in an exhibit, tour, or otherwise? So allow me to zoom out just for a second to tell you about the broader story of our site and who we are, because this significantly impacts the conversation as I begin talking about deaccessioning. The Coolidge site is an entire village that's dedicated to the preservation of the boyhood home of our 30th president. It has a reputation for being one of the best preserved presidential sites because we have the original buildings in their original locations with their original artifacts. So the photo that you see here is an example of that. It is showing the Grange Hall over top our historic general store. And this was the site of the 1924 summer White House. So the tables and chairs that you're looking at are the original furniture that were used by President Coolidge and his staff while working in that space. So Plymouth Notch became a tourist destination starting on August 3rd, 1923, and has never stopped. From the very moment that Calvin Coolidge took the oath of office in his father's home, people started coming to the site to wish him well or to understand who he is or was. The home where he was born first opened as a museum in 1924 by the villagers of Plymouth. The state had its first presence in 1947 when it acquired the building pictured here, which is the Wilder House, and it had been the childhood home of Coolidge's mother, and she married his father in the front room. So a decade later, in 1957, the son of the president gifted the Coolidge homestead to the state, and that's when we really started cooking with gas. So the Coolidges had a housekeeper for 48 years who saved literally everything and changed nothing. So the house, she resisted all forms of modernization, including electricity and indoor plumbing. Fast forward to 1988, the state hired the site's first administrator. I'm sure many of you probably know and love Bill Jenny. who devoted more than 34 years to the site. So I was hired just under a year ago, which makes me the site's second ever steward. And I've been trying to learn the site's buildings and collections since then. So part of my process has included reappraising the traditional activities of the site in light of this year's centennial anniversary. So August 3rd will mark 100 years since Coolidge took the oath again in his father's home here on the site. And as I looked towards special exhibits, events, and programming built around that occasion, my attention was directed towards the contents of the house to seek out what themes or aspects we might want to highlight in this celebratory year. It became apparent that we have a tremendous volume of stuff. And when the Coolidge homestead came into state possession, all of the contents in that house came with it. So that includes everything from the furniture right on down to the dandruff tonics, olive oils, and 52 bajillion stubby pencils circa 1910. And you all know what I'm talking about because our houses have them too. So it's unclear to me how much of the house and contents were documented at the time of the gift. And it is clear that greater contextualization efforts probably could have been made in 1957. Extraneous materials in the junk drawers probably should have been weeded, but there seems to have been this feeling that if the Coolidges touched it and owned it, it was worth saving and valuable. So while this is remarkable in the sense that we have a house that's entirely intact, the reality is that constraints in finances and the availability of staff time, meaning me as the sole full-time administrator, makes this level of retention and preservation an impossibility. Sometime around 2010, the site was awarded an IMLS grant to begin the arduous task of incorporating the artifacts into Past Perfect, or at least a revamped Past Perfect. So far as I'm aware, this is the largest descriptive undertaking in the history of the site and involved numerous interns as well as a dedicated project staff member. The amount of cataloging that was completed at that time is astonishing, but it might have been made simpler by weeding projects prior to that point. So as the new administrator, I'm casting an eye on the house and the surroundings for the first time, and I'm peering into places that are both public and private to reevaluate. So I'm looking at everything again through the lens of a storyteller. What story is the Coolidge House currently saying, and what statements should it be making or emphasizing about the man, life in rural Vermont, or a specific moment in history? How do the artifacts enhance or detract from visitor experiences? And perhaps a little more radically, I'm considering the Coolidge seasonal employees. I want to understand what they're highlighting on the tours, what they're interacting with, and I'm factoring the people who have worked with me or have worked for the site as long as 5, 10, or even 20 years. So what knowledge do they have that I might want to know as I'm beginning the deaccessioning process? So allow me to just show you one space that's encapsulating the kinds of decisions and questions that I will be asking as I'm embarking on the deaccessioning process. So I'm showing here one of the interpretive signs that's in the Coolidge homestead. And while I do intend to rewrite the interpretive text and offer more graphics, this is what's currently there. So the text describes this room as a place for turning raw milk into other creamery products. It's brief and paints a general picture, but offers no details about the kinds of artifacts that one might expect to find in this room. And that description is in direct contradiction to what the visitors actually see. So they interact with this room only in the sense that it's a plexiglass doorway through which they may peer. But when they do stop to look, they're seeing things as flower pots, soda bottles, and just a mishmash again of stuff. So the tours led by my guides currently do not discuss this space in depth. It's something that appears along the route towards more historically significant rooms. I think that's something that we need to change. So here's my concerns with this space. First, it doesn't look like a functional place. I don't think that I can easily walk into this room and begin the process of quote unquote buttery. The shelves are pretty cluttered and it doesn't allow a viewer to comprehend individual components. The floor is covered by heavier jugs, crates, and objects that are clearly part of a display, but not setting a scene or a vignette into what Coolidge life might have looked like. And I want us to be able to tell the function of the room from sight and not only through a textual sign. I want what us to say about the room actually matches what our visitors see. So in regards to what's on the shelf, I know at the start that I want to thin the herd, so to speak, but I need to determine how to do that. And some of this is obvious, but for every object, I am researching what we know about it through the Past Perfect database. And again, that 2010 cataloging projects. In most cases, it's very little, if anything at all. And most entries describe the physical appearance of the item, but cannot tell me the significance or even the function of the item. So I don't know if you can unmute yourselves for a second, but just to make a quick point, can anyone shout out what you think we're looking at here? Or type it up in the chat, maybe someone can read it.
Well, there's clearly pig's fat on the far left. We've got that. But butter ingredients and preservation ingredients.
Okay. Anyone else guesses?
I was gonna say like medicinal, some medicinal ingredients.
Okay. Yep. All right, well, the plain fact is I don't know. And I don't think the people who are cataloging knew either, because a lot of them are guesses and they use vague language. I might even say inappropriate claims based on the fact that we're not certain. So let me just show you a couple of examples. This would be that jar of red stuff. You can see the issue. We have the powder might be paprika. We have no idea what the date range is, so we've been very broad. And frankly, I'm not going to stick my nose in this jar to find out what it is. And that's the simple truth. This is something that's labeled boiled, but we have a direct contradiction in our own catalog. So under other name, it says maple syrup or sap, but then in the description, it labels it as probably linseed oil. Those two things are entirely different. And again, I am not going to find out. I just, the description in general, I take some issue with, the contents inside are amber colored with heavy, dark, and white sediment in the interior bottom. I'm not even going to hazard a guess. And after 100 years on the shelves, I'm just not sure that the compositional breakdown, what byproducts might have been created by that are hazardous to my health. So I label this as one big problem jar. I've got another one here. This could be soap. Again, date ranges are an issue. The entry for this item makes mention later on down in Past Perfect to the condition and notes that there's a massive crack on the bottom of the jar. To me, that seems like information that we might want to put in the description up front so that the reader knows to be aware that there seems to be some sort of issue with this item. But more importantly, what I'm asking as I read this is, if I don't know that that's soap for sure, how have those contents maybe seeped through that crack? If I touch it, am I going to put myself in danger? Or how sitting on the shelf has that maybe contaminated the other items around that? So I have a lot of concerns. So all of this to sum up that right off the bat, my plans include deaccessioning all of the goopy substances, powders, and mystery liquids. I'll just give you a few more additional slides to show you up close what we're talking about. These tin jars had labels on them. The labels have fallen off and are now on the bottom of that shelf, not viewable from this perspective. You are absolutely right. I think that there could be medicinal things on these shelves, and the point with that, given the time period that we're talking about, which would be late 1800s, early 20th century, some of the medicinal substances include controlled substances like cocaine. And so these are things that I probably need to be aware of as I am trying to handle them appropriately and disposition them appropriately. Again, there's that boiled jar and the brightest orange liquid I've ever seen in my life that is definitely not high C. I don't know. Okay, so the appraisal questions that I'm asking at the start, just to sort of float what's obvious to the top so that I can begin to make some really easy decisions. My first question is it safe? And in the objects that we just talked about, my answer is no. That's pretty clear, and I'm going to err on the side of caution. Secondly, is it from the time period that I'm portraying? So I have made the determination that we are using August 3rd, 1923 as the cutoff date. The Coolidge's housekeeper did reside in the house until 1956. So there are some glassware, etc., that extends past the era of the Coolidge's residence in the house. So I will be eliminating that from our display. Is it the best example I have, and do I have others? Again, this is a whole village, so I have numerous barns and attics. And if it's a pretty common tool, chances are I have about 100 of them. So I want to make sure that I'm grabbing the best example and thinking carefully about how many I need to have based on financial constraints. So probably more than one and less than 10 is what I would say. And then are there examples that I can maybe share with other museums and institutions across the state or perhaps the country, just to spread the wealth? If it's something that's particularly educational. Is it significant? So what do I know about it? And again, this is really where, for me, my tour guides are going to come into the conversation, given that some of them have been there a decade or longer. What information do they have squirreled away because they've been studying Coolidge much, much longer than I have and interacting with a lot of these things. So I want to make sure that I'm including them in the conversation. And that might be something that's more unique to our site. I don't know that that's appropriate for everybody, but I think that in my case, it is. Is this the best environment for it? So the Buttery is in an unheated building, which we shut down at the end of October and will not be occupied again until May. So when it was negative 29 degrees in January here, that building is approximately maybe a little higher than negative 29. So not the healthiest environments for my artifacts. So are they okay there? Do they need to move? If in moving them, I'm introducing new hazards. These are all risks, you know, things that I need to weigh in that conversation. But most importantly, does it enhance a visitor's understanding of quote unquote Buttery? Can it be clearly understood what this object is, or does it need additional interpretation? And I bring that up to show you just sort of an example of something that I recently decided. This is the oil lamp and Bible that was significant to Coolidge's oath of office ceremony, which occurred at 2:47 a.m. So in the dark without electricity. Given that this is a centennial year, these are the key artifacts across our site that are going to be things that we want to discuss at length and make sure that people have an opportunity to see. So this is the same object on the right and the left. And the question is, which view provides context and which one provides information? So the image on the left shows what a visitor would be seeing in the homestead. That is as close as they will come to that lamp in the Bible. The view on the left, however, is the potential view that they could have if I put that in a display case in the museum and allowed them to have a much more personal interaction. So I don't know that there's an answer to which one is best. I just know that at least for the next 2 years, we will be removing those objects to the museum to allow that up close look. And because I have enough other examples of contemporary lamps, it will replace obviously the star of the show, at least for 2 years. And again, we will reevaluate that. I'll seek the feedback of our tour guides and just figure out what they heard and what maybe was the pro or the con of this change. So next steps for the Buttery, objects that I'm certain I'm deaccessioning, again, those hazards, duplicates, or out of the scope of our time period will be forwarded to a collections committee. And for that just means my colleagues at the other state historic sites. The objects that I'm considering for deaccessioning, I plan to remove from public view to allow me to have the opportunity to view the site without them, understand how people move or flow in those spaces, and how that might change the narrative that we're telling. At the end of that period, I will again reevaluate. We'll talk to the seasonal employees and figure out how that changed their telling of the story or their interpretation of the house and what they highlighted. And then if at the end of that, we've determined that there are no informational values or reasons for us to maybe keep that item, maybe we have others, again, we will document that decision and seek disposition. So at that point, I think I'm turning it over to my colleagues to let them have a go. All right.
Okay. Thank you, Rejoice. That was actually very, very well done. broad perspective and focusing in on just one issue, and then the tasks that have to be undertaken in a site that is especially yours. So next, I am going to share with you the notes from Matthew Powers. And for those of you who don't know Matthew, here's a little bit of a background on him. Matthew Powers received an MA in American and New England Studies from the University of Southern Maine. He has worked for 22 years in several historical organizations, including the Remick Country Doctor Museum Farm, Sandwich Historical Society, St. Johnsbury Athenaeum, and currently the Woodstock History Center. He has been the executive director of the Woodstock History Center for almost 10 years and loves local history, research, and education. He currently serves as treasurer of the Windsor Central Innovation Fund, chair of the Town of Woodstock Historic Preservation Commission, board member of the Green Mountain Perkins Academy, museum professional in the Vermont Historical Society's League of Local Historical Societies and Museums, Mentors Program, member of the Vermont Curators Group, and member of the Collections Care and Conservation Alliance, as well as a member of the New England Museum Association. So Matt's notes are the following, and please forgive me for reading them. The Woodstock History Center. In the past, we have used many ways to dispose of deaccessioned objects. We've had an auction, threw damaged objects away, gifted them to other institutions, held public sales, and transferred them to our education collection. No matter what we have done, I've realized that disposing of materials is complicated and takes up a lot of your time. We're continuing to be active with deaccessioning objects. We have a collections committee meeting once a month, and I'm trying to have at least 1 or 2 objects every meeting that we're proposing for deaccessioning, which will then have to come in front of the board and be finalized with a decision. I'm trying to focus on the lowest hanging fruit when it comes to our pruning, which is for us, quote unquote, limited scope, intended use, and it cannot be properly stored or maintained. These first round objects mainly consist of historic objects that have been put into our educational collection. I'm focusing on items that have no number and are not being properly stored. If there are objects that have clear provenance, we always reach out to another museum first. When the object's provenance is not obvious, we conduct research so that we are better informed about where they can possibly go. To date, we have gifted items to museums and libraries, and there have been organizations that are relative in proximity to our place. Most of our deaccessioned objects have gone to public auction, sale, or another event. This consisted of a special antique sale event, antique book sale, and listing items via a listserv, an online forum. Many of our books were given to the local libraries for their book sale, as it wasn't advantageous for us to have an additional book sale. We have considered consignments at local antiques malls as well as an auction house. Ultimately, many of our deaccessioned objects have no real monetary value, so utilizing an auction house is out of the question. We have begun to weigh how much time is involved in trying to sell those items versus giving them to another nonprofit organization, which can then profit off of the sale. Some other organizations are beginning to limit what they receive as they're incurring additional disposal costs. To sum up our methods of disposal, they are donation to another museum, library, archive, or nonprofit organization, exchange of items between cultural institutions, transfer to an education collection, recycling or destruction, repatriation, restitution to the rightful owner, and last, public auction, sale, or another event. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Matt, who will talk about the Vermont Historical Society. And I'm sorry, Steve, about the Vermont Historical Society.
Not a problem. Thanks, Darlene. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. So of course, it's going to be the wrong tab, but give me a second. There we go. Okay. On we go. So I'm the director of the Vermont Historical Society, the society for the entire state of Vermont. We are an independent 501c3 organization, unlike in other states where it may be a part of state government or part of some other entity. We are a bit of an oddball amongst our peers in that we're independent, but we were created by the state back in 1838 by act of legislature, and there are a number of statutes that do govern how we operate, and we do rely on the state for some of our operating funds, and we do provide services to local societies around the state of Vermont. For those of you who are not in Vermont, there's at current count 191 local historical societies in the state of Vermont, and this question does come up a lot of what do we do with all of our stuff? Do we just take everything? How do we move it on? How do we dispose of it? So I was asked to talk about kind of a couple of unique projects that we did here at the Vermont Historical Society, and specifically how we dispose of items after the deaccession process. So I assume many of you have done the 101 course or understand the process of deaccessioning, but then what do you do once you finish that? I did throw in a couple of slides when I heard Matt wasn't going to be with us, in case we had a little extra time and wanted to talk about it, about our specific object inventory project here at the Vermont Historical Society. We have approximately 30,000 items in our museum collection. It's not counting our library or archives, which we managed a different way under a different set of policies. So I will be speaking specifically to the museum collection at this point. So we have, as far as I could tell, we had never done a comprehensive inventory of the collections of the Vermont Historical Society. And so starting in 2019, we are now undertaking that inventory, and our collections manager, Teresa Green, manages that. And she started that year in 2019, and we hired her with an eye towards this project. And she created a series of documents to help guide inventory that would then move us toward evaluation and potential deaccessioning. So that's the part I will tease you with a little bit, and we can go into it later in questions or afterwards if we have the time. These are a couple of images of Teresa within some of our object storage facility in Barre, Vermont. They're just beauty shots of, here's some stuff, here's some shelves. She's reviewing those. We use the Catalog It online software package. We moved off of Past Perfect. It seems to work well for us. It's a good one, certainly for smaller historical societies. We like it because it's completely cloud-based and will run on any device. So I run it off my phone when I'm in collections. You can see Teresa's using a tablet here as she works her way through inventory. But as Teresa's working her way through the collections, unpacking boxes, looking at objects and everything, she created a plan. She's entitled to Evaluating the Collection for Possible Deaccession. And it involves at its core a grading system. We did not invent this. We adapted it from the Indianapolis Museum of Art, and I know there's some articles that they have put out about this process, but for us it works really well. It works well internally and when we're communicating with folks outside of our organization, because pretty much everybody understands those letter grades, A, B, C, D, and F. And we've gone so far as to even, like a school would do, we created a rubric with a point spread. And so this is a summary that you see on the screen here of where the points are that equal those grades, and what, in general terms, an object needs to do to get those points. Beyond this summary here, we do look at Vermont history, and there's a number of ways to score points or lose points for the object around its history base. We are a history museum, so we're looking at that first and foremost, as opposed to our artistic merit. Then we look at condition, and it can gain points or lose points based on the condition of the item. And then part 3 is other considerations that does take into account fine art, duplicate items, or if an item represents an underrepresented group within our collection, it gets bonus points for that. So when it's all said and done, an object ends up with a grade. And ideally, if we've done our work correctly, that grade can go with that object wherever it goes, and it is enshrined within its catalog record. So anything that is a D or an F kind of automatically goes on that list for possible deaccession. And then anything that scores an A or B does not. A or B goes right back in. C is where the real discussion takes place, and that's when our Director of Collections and Access and I start to get involved, and we work with the collections manager to really investigate those items and do some thinking about it. And any one of us can pull those items out to keep and not deassess, and then ultimately we present the C, D, and F items to our collections committee, which meets 4 times a year for deaccession. So it's a very active project because we are inventorying. And like I said, I just wanted to introduce that. We can talk about it more if we have time. So what I was supposed to talk about was disposal. What do we do after we've decided that this item or this group of items no longer belongs in our collection? How do we dispose of it? I am a huge fan of policy. So we did similar projects when I was at the Bennington Museum, and always to make sure that we have a policy that not only says what you have to go through to deassess something, but also how do we dispose of that, and ideally, what do you do with the proceeds of that? Certainly, museum ethics says that all proceeds of deaccessioned objects should go into purchasing more objects for your collection, and sometimes direct conservation of items. So that is our policy. We are a bit constrained. There was a statute that was passed in the state of Vermont in the late 70s that held us to that. I don't know what happened to cause that, but there is that. So you can see, I just took a screenshot of the section of our rather expansive collections policy document on how we dispose of this. And this is so helpful. And this is really helpful for you as a staff or as a director or as a volunteer board, because if there's ever any question, just go back to the policy. We have this policy, we followed the policy. Ours is pretty straightforward. Like I said, we have a library collection that's separate from our museum object collection. So sometimes things may go back and forth between those two collections. No board action is required for that at all. It's not really a deaccession. It gets moved from one collection to the other. But outside of number 1 there, you can see we can transfer this to our education collection. Our collections committee loves that as an option, but our educators don't, because it usually just means they get a lot of junk dumped on them. But when I say education collection, we have these kits we lend out to schools. Our educators do in-museum programs where you may want to hand something around that students can hold or use. And so you don't want that to be part of your museum collection. So it's a good place to put things, especially things that don't have a lot of value, sale value to your museum, to move those to some sort of educational use. Number 3, we can transfer these to another public institution, sell, exchange, or gift. Usually it's just gift. We're looking at, here's an item that really applies to the Stowe Historical Society. It's not something that rises to the level of us keeping here, and we'll contact them and usually just make that transfer. That feels good to everybody. Number 4, sale at public auction. We also use that a lot. I'll talk more about that later on. And then the last one, this should always be in your policy, because you're always going to end up with some things that you can't be required to have to keep or sell something that really just should be destroyed. I mean, in some cases, it's destroyed itself. You pull something out of a collection that is, a piece of silk that is just shattered and it's just dust in the bottom of a box. So you go through the process, it gets deassessed, but it's just going to get thrown away. And we do that as well. Also put in that policy here, and again, another thing to think of, because a lot of this is public perception as you're moving things out of a museum. is to make sure that there's not even a whiff of giving something to somebody, staff, board, agents acting on behalf of those folks. They can't buy them, they can't have them. That's where it is. We have a little exception in there. I think it found its way in because if a board member, say, works for another museum and you're making an exchange or something like that. But generally speaking, we try to stay out of all those things. So that's our current disposal policy here at the Vermont Historical Society, and we generally stick to all 5 of those. I know there's a little out in there that says it's not limited to 1 or more of the following, but we really just try to follow those 5 options. So when I was at the Bennington Museum, and I wanted to put 2011 there, that's when I left the Bennington Museum, because I don't know if this is their exact policy anymore, and I don't think Callie's on the call, who's the collections manager down there. But it's just a slight change in the policy, and I wanted to point this out. It's just another museum that we used a different site. So we talk about open market. That's generally speaking open market public sale, usually at an auction house. But we did put some language into this that if we were going to use dealers to sell something, that we had to get 2 dealers and they had to give us bids of how much they were going to sell it for. We couldn't just turn it over to 1 dealer to say, hey, sell this for us. And then it also has some language in there around if you're going to exchange something, making sure we get an appraisal to make sure that the exchange matches. Here at the Vermont Historical Society, we avoid all of this. We generally do not use private dealers or private sale. It's too opaque. So my feeling, and I know our institution's feeling, is if you're going to sell something, sell it at public auction. It's out there, it creates its own price based on that auction. Maybe you'll get a little less than if you did through a private sale, but no one can accuse you of favoritism or favoring one dealer over another. It's just it's as clean as it can be. So when thinking of disposing of your items, I kind of think of 3 different things as I'm looking at something that we're needing to move away. It's been deassessed. It's not going to stay in our collection anymore. And these are all things that we want as an institution. We want money. We want to be able to grow our collection or take care of our collections. And so that is a huge aspect of what we're going to do with an item. There's also politics about that, of like, who may be offended? Is there a descendant over here, or, a couple of cousins, or actual politics? Do I have to deal with a state rep from a town where this item may have come from, in considering how we deassess or dispose of that item? And then the last thing is just community goodwill. Do we want the perception that we're just selling everything out of the museum on a regular basis? Or are we trying to give a better idea to them of, oh, no, we're really culling our collection, we're thinking really hard, and we're using these objects to build up local societies in our state and help augment their collections for items that we don't have. And these things are all kind of equal in my mind, and in our collections manager mind, as we think about what the disposal is going to be. And if you say, is money a factor? Absolutely. If something is going to bring in $100,000 to the collections and acquisitions fund of the museum, that may outweigh the politics or the goodwill of transferring that item to a local society. And I think that's okay. That certainly is something all museums need. And the goal of deassessing and the philosophy behind it is that by moving these things out of your collection, you are creating capacity to add more, better, more diverse things that tell better stories to your collection. What do we want to avoid? We want to avoid this. There was a public auction in 1971 on the State House lawn in Vermont, and the public auction benefited the Vermont Historical Society. The Historical Society museum still is located in Montpelier, but kind of moved around in spaces. It started in the State House, and then it moved into a purpose-built building, which is now the Supreme Court building. And we were there for a number of years. And then, as courts do, they expanded, and Vermont Historical Society got squeezed out of that space. But they built a brand new office building called the Pavilion Office Building on the site of an old hotel next to the Capitol, and the basement and first floor of that building were purpose-built for the Vermont Historical Society. And that opened in 1971. So they had a big fundraising campaign to help install that museum and install that library in the Pavilion building. The State House itself had a whole bunch of things that at the time were considered old and nobody needed. So chairs, desks, spittoons, that's what you see on the lower right. Great vestiges of State House, that every desk had a spittoon on it. But they also included books from the Vermont Historical Society library that they didn't want anymore. And members of the Historical Society and board members could donate antiques to this sale. So, none of that really is inherently wrong, but what the messaging looked like was that the Vermont Historical Society was selling its stuff on the State House lawn to help build a new museum. And we still hear from people saying, oh, you guys have a lot of really cool stuff. When are you going to have another sale? When are you going to have another big tent sale? And I think that that's a perception we do not want to propagate as museums that are working in the public good, that we don't have sales. We don't just set up a tent on the front lawn and have an auction or a yard sale of our items. So that's why I say avoid this. I think well-meaning board members may say, oh, we could earn a lot of money if we just had we had our own sale, we wouldn't have to pay any fees or whatnot. But it's a perception of problem, and it could possibly be a legal problem. So instead, as I said, I would step into the sales side of things. When we sell things, we generally speaking, and in my 8 years here at the Historical Society, we have not sold any deaccessed items through any other venue than auction. But there are a lot of auction houses out there. And so things to think about when choosing an auction house. What's their specialty? So what are you selling? Are you just selling a big box of costume or a box of shoes or something like that? Or do you have something spectacular? Do you have a piece of artwork painted by a European master in your collection, but it doesn't match your mission at all? So you want to look at specialties. So if it is something kind of unique, is it maritime? Is it related to boats or the sea? You want to look at auction houses that have specialization in those areas, not because they're going to. What they're going to bring to you is they're going to bring an audience to you. So people who want to buy maritime stuff are more likely to be perusing the auction catalogs or online listings of an auction house that specializes in maritime stuff. So usually you can get a higher price, you can get more money for your item. Think about location too. What are you selling? Is there a regional audience for that item? Again, is it something that needs to be sold in Boston or New York? Or is it something that makes more sense to be sold locally? Is there going to be more interest from a local audience in buying it, whereas someone in Boston and New York is not really going to care? Fees, that's another thing to look at. All auction houses have fees, and it's kind of like Ticketmaster. They love to kind of slap them on there. So there's the basic fee of a percentage of the sale goes to the auction house, but they like to throw in other fees too. There's a transportation fee, or there's a assessment fee, or there's a photography fee, or a describing fee. So look at what that fee structure is, and often as a nonprofit or a small museum, you can negotiate those fees down or get them eliminated completely, which is really helpful. Community ties, that goes back to that bullet point that goes beyond money, that goes to goodwill. Is it a well-respected local auction house, especially if you're looking at those things that have a local appeal or kind of large lots of smalls. Are there local auction houses that you want to keep happy, that you want to bring business their way, knowing that they're going to make a donation to your next gala, or they're going to come do an appraisal fair for you? So there's that to think about as well. I put ability/interest in messaging. So again, this somewhat goes back to community ties or specialty. As you dispose of items as a museum, you want to make sure that you have control of that messaging. You want to be able to say, yes, these items were deassessed from the Vermont Historical Society because they didn't meet the mission, and the proceeds of this sale are going to support the collections or furthering the collections of the Vermont Historical Society. It's one of the kind of standard sentences we use. We want to make sure that whatever auction house we use is using our messaging, and they're not just saying rare Vermont clock being sold by the Vermont Historical Society. That may help their sales, but it doesn't help us at all. And then other services, and that goes back to the kind of the community ties. By selling with that auction house, does that have, will they come in and do an assessment of some of your other collections for you gratis? Will they help out with your next charity auction at your gala? And then kind of direct services, will they do really good photography? Do they have an online newsletter that they're going to send out? Do they have a Rolodex of big donors that they want to get your item out to? Those are other services to look at that an auctioneer may have. So here's my example object that we went through a few years ago. We called this the Clement clock. You can see it's kind of this pile of decoration on a huge, massive oak clock. I show you these old black and white images because this thing was always on view at the Vermont Historical Society from 1944 when it came into the collection until it went out our doors in the fall of 2019. The picture on the left of the screen that says Vermont Historical Society above it, time rules all, that's actually carved into the clock. That was our membership brochure for a number of years in the early 70s. And then the picture on the right shows it in place in what at the time was called the Victorian drawing room of the museum in Montpelier. So it really had a place of primacy. Everybody saw it when they came into the museum. It was actually in a free space, so you weren't behind a paywall. That Victorian lobby was open to anybody who wanted to wander through. And it's striking. I mean, it's huge. It's I can't remember how tall it is, 17, 18 feet tall, and then really highly carved. But we have to look critically at everything that we have in our collection. And at the time, the statue was coming off the top of the Vermont State House. And again, for those of you who aren't from Vermont, we take a lot of pride in our State House. It's a beautiful golden dome. It's a wooden dome on top and has a wooden carved statue, the embodiment of agriculture on top. And they last about 100 years before they start to disintegrate. And so this was the second statue was coming down to make way for the third statue. And working with the state curator's office decided that a good location for that conserved second statue would be at the Vermont Historical Society. We do have remnants of the very first statue as well. So we put a display in the place where it would go, the best place is where that clock is. So a couple of things driving that. Background on the clock, interesting story. So it was called the Clement clock because the clock was purchased by Percival Clement. He was the 57th governor of Vermont. He only served one term, 1919 to 1921. He was from Rutland, Vermont, family involved in the marble industry, banking, and kind of hospitality, very wealthy family of the time. And he actually bought a rather large hotel in New York. He was traveling in England prior to World War I and was looking for something to decorate his New York hotel. And he saw this clock. It purports to be a 17th century Baroque clock. It's actually not, as we've determined it's a 19th century revival piece, but he thought it was that old. And so he purchased, made of English oak, he purchased it for his New York hotel. World War I broke out and he couldn't get it shipped back to the United States, and it ended up not being shipped back to the United States till after the war was over. At that point, he had sold his New York hotel, so he didn't have a place to put the clock. He ended up being elected governor for that one term, and he put it in the governor's office. So it sat in the State House in the governor's office, and then when he left it there. It turned out the State House didn't really want it. And after his death, his family didn't want it because it was so big, they didn't know what to do with it. So, you know, what does anybody do with stuff they don't want? Give it to your historical society. So in 1944, it was transferred to the Vermont Historical Society. Again, really, I'd say so large that the only place it could be was on view. So it was always on view at the Vermont Historical Society. Just a side note on Percival Clement now, as we start to think about our history, you can see he was governor of Vermont during the passing of the 19th Amendment. He did not believe in the 19th Amendment and refused to call the legislature back into session to ratify that amendment. Of course, that's the amendment that gave women the right to vote. So kind of a black mark for Percival Clement. How much do we want to be memorializing a single term governor with this huge clock, especially with that background? So with all of that information, it received a D in our grading system, and we brought it to our collections committee, and there was a lot of discussion. I mean, this was not an easy conversation to have. I think everybody really understood that it did not belong in our collection, but the worry was it had been on view for so long and is in every postcard we published of the quote unquote Victorian drawing room, and you know, using it in publications and everything, that visitors would be upset if they did not see the clock when they came to the museum. But ultimately, we moved the committee on to thinking about we need to think about space, the object, and I think it really helped that we were getting this really cool big statue from on top of the State House that helped move it. So they ended up voting to remove it. We decided to go with a auction sale, and started looking at auction houses. We decided it's such a big clock, has nothing to do with Vermont inherently as a decorative arts object. So it really needed to go to a clock specialist. And so we were looking at regional clock specialists, and it's also really huge and heavy. And we did not have the expertise to take it apart and transport it. So those are all things to think about. Probably would have brought the highest amount of money if it had sold in Europe, but we weren't about to ship it across the Atlantic. So we looked at a number of auction houses. We ended up with Bonham Skinner. And really, because they have a whole department to clocks and experts to work with clocks, we felt they had a good market reach to get a good price for that for us. They were willing to waive all of their fees and then reduce their auction percentage for us. And the biggest thing is they were willing to send a crew of art handlers in a truck up to Montpelier to disassemble it and transport it back to Boston. So those were all considerations on our part and why we chose Bonham Skinner for the sale. These are some pictures of the art handlers on the left. The guy on the right is now our chair of our board, and I thought I would love to include a picture of him. He is a clock collector, and this was like Christmas morning for him when he was given permission to come and help take this clock apart and help pack it up. So, you know, use your volunteers, use your board if it makes sense. And he loved it. He had a grand time moving that out. So the clock ended up, the sale was in April of 2020. We all know what was going on in the April of 2020. So it went from being an in-person sale to an online sale, but we were very happy. The auction estimate was $40,000 and the clock went for $100,000. So a really good choices, I think, on the sale side of thing. From a public relations, what did we do? We created a little bulleted fact sheet for our front desk about the clock. not nearly as in depth as the background I gave you on the clock, but saying, yep, the clock did belong to a Vermont governor, but it was not made in the United States. It was purchased for a hotel in New York. It's not what it purports to be. It was a 19th century recreation of a 17th century clock. It was brought to the Vermont Historical Society as decoration, and it served that role in this, Victorian room. We don't interpret that room as a Victorian room anymore. And we needed to make room for this really cool folk art statue of agriculture that's going in. Our board was worried. Not a single pushback, not a single person. I think maybe we had 2 or 3 people said, hey, where's the clock? They were told what happened to the clock, and it was gone, and it was not a problem. So Darlene asked me to just tell who we use. So I know those of you who are local to Vermont, I'm not endorsing these or anything else. I'm just telling you, these are some of the auction houses that we at Vermont Historical Society use. We use Merrill's Auctioneers and Appraisers. They're based out of Northern Vermont in Williston. A lot of smalls, a lot of small lots. We've got big chunks of stuff. We go to them. They've been great. They're really, really good guys, and they volunteer a lot with us. They're willing to come over and pick things up, and we don't have to transport. And so that's probably the top one that we use all the time. We really like them. We also send stuff to W.A. Smith and Augusta Auctions. W.A. Smith's in New Hampshire, so we do find a fair amount of New Hampshire stuff in our collection. We'll send over there, and Augusta Auctions specializes in costume. We're doing a lot of costume work right now. And then I put Bonham Skinner on there because they just did our clock. So that's, yeah, I'll stop there. I think I filled up my time, Darlene. How was that?
That was wonderful, Steve. Thank you for that excellent overview of the collection and a case study, and a little bit of the explaining of the auction process, which dovetails very nicely with what I put together. As I wasn't planning on being a full or double speaker today, I thought I would offer you all some tips from my 25 plus years in the museum field. I've seen a lot. I've heard a lot, and there are a lot of stories I can't share because matters are confidential, but I will tell you one thing: deaccessioning and the problem of what to do with things after has always been a large part of the conversation at the table with respect to any kind of conference or event that takes place talking about museum collections. And I think it will always continue to be, and even the conversation post-COVID is going to get a lot more intense. I totally agree with Matt and with Steve that it's complicated, it's time consuming, it should be based on collection management policies, and it needs to happen. So if your institution isn't doing anything yet, there will be the chance that there is something down the pike for you to consider deaccessioning and to go through the whole entire process, as Rejoice is learning and as she shared with us already. I believe we have a very varied audience, from institution types to sizes to the museum professional experiences to volunteers to some who are just interested in learning more about this policy and this task that takes place with dealing with collections in any kind of institution. So here are some tips for you. Some are a repetition of what Steve has already shared, and they're offered in no particular order. Just tips I've accumulated from the work I've done and suggestions I make to my clients, just for organization and streamline and efficiency. If you are considering objects for deaccessioning for down, excuse me, down the road a little bit, and you've just gone through some deaccessioning that's ready to be, it's already been approved and is ready to be taken to the next step, isolate those objects in your collection storage or wherever your objects are. Because there will be a time that you, if you're the jack of all trades, or if you have a very small staff, you're going to be put under pressure to take on someone else's priority. You're going to be short-staffed of time, and you're not going to have the opportunity to necessarily get back and complete a project. So isolate things that are in various stages of deaccessioning. Let's all be honest, not everyone reads signs, but as long as you know what's going on, that's what's important. But you also have to set up for the next person who might be dealing with something if there's a great length of period of time that you haven't been able to get back to a project. So somehow, tag those objects and somehow state what the process, the status of the process is, so no one is confused. Enter that information into the database so you know where things are if they're not in the locations that they typically are in. Do an inventory of those groups of items that have been deaccessioned if you have not already done so in preparation for any type of collections meeting. And have that inventory will serve as documentation for those object files later when you get to that auction sale phase. It will also aid the auction house in saving some of their work that they're going to be doing on site, which saves time and can save money. And it helps you streamline later your database duties once things are deaccessioned and moving out of the collection. Photograph any physical material provenance information in the object file. And this is a very important point, is the provenance information that might exist with the object that you have. And of course, we're talking in generalities here, and it's all object dependent. You may have things with very, very little, if none at all, in your collection provenance for that particular object, but you might have something that has a high degree of provenance information. I will state now, and I'll talk a little bit in a few minutes about resources for you, but I did contribute an essay with respect to retaining provenance information in alignment with the object being sold, an essay that was published in the book, Is It Okay to Sell the Monet? I have always believed, contrary to some of my colleagues, that the provenance information in its original state, or if what you have is a photocopy, should go with the object being deaccessioned. You no longer own that object, so you really no longer have need of that information, and the new buyer, the new steward, does have need of it. So if, for example, you have an original or a photocopy letter in your file that is a letter from the artist to the first owner, that is provenance. If you have an invoice or anything material that was given to you by the donor, is considered the provenance information. Maybe that painting was in an exhibition and you happen to have a copy of that exhibition catalog. Keep a copy of whatever it is in your object file. And again, I say the original should go with the object, and the original in the state that you have it. Once that property is consigned, once the property you have consigned to the auction house is sold, that ownership transfers. So that's when the original, or what you have in your file, goes with the piece. I have experienced too many times that you should not depend on the auction house to safeguard that original material. It's best for you to hold it, because again, until it's sold, while the process is of consignment and it's still consigned until it's paid for, you need to hold that information and then just get it transferred to the buyer when the auction house can match you up. Retain accession numbers on the pieces. Any identified numbers or labels should stay on the piece. Maybe there's an inventory label from a prior auction, or when the piece was moved into storage. Maybe there's exhibition labels. That all serves to the provenance of that piece. And knowing how difficult it is to do provenance research when it's so unavailable oftentimes, or there was a misconstrued communication or understanding and all information about an institution selling pieces was removed, that doesn't help the bottom line of really testifying to that piece's history. Photograph in detail all labels that are on back of pieces if you haven't already, before, say, for example, a frame painting goes to consignment to an auction house, so you have that documentation in your object files. If there are any loose exhibition labels, I remember there was a period of time when I was still full staff at the Springfield Museums in Springfield, Mass, that any exhibition labels that came in from pieces going out on loan were just thrown into the file, not put onto the piece. And that piece sometimes wound up being sold, and those labels are no longer with it, hence a break in the provenance. If you have no experience in selling through auctions, Steve has set a very good foundation of information for you, and I would just like to add some tidbits. Ask your colleagues, if you're looking to figure out who to use, ask colleagues who you know who have sold through auction. Who did they use? Who is the contact? What did they sell? So you can compare whether what you have available is something that they sold. What was the process like? Can they walk you through from the initial contact through to the sale? And were they satisfied with the experience? And that doesn't mean the bottom line of what money they got, because that's all relative. Were they satisfied with the experience itself? Do your own research of a particular house or others that you may find. Again, as Steve mentioned, look locally, look statewide, look regionally. A Western painting that is in fine condition and done by a well-recognized artist isn't necessarily going to sell well in Vermont online or in person. It's going to sell best at a house in the Midwest that specializes in Western paintings and specializes specifically in that particular artist. And again, we're talking about things of a bit more value in this instance. In your research for particular houses, look around the website. Does it have a link to realized prices for their sales? Oftentimes, houses will not go through that added expense with a website developer. They'll just figure that somebody that's interested will go elsewhere, or will call them and they'll determine whether they're going to give that information out. Look at various platforms. Many houses connect now with sales on Live Auctioneers or Bid Square, where you can go and get a realized price for a particular lot, which is comparable to what you're selling, as in the type of object. Try to find two types of sources. Are there discrepancies with what may be listed on Live Auctioneers as far as a sale price and what maybe the auction house, if they have their own platform, is listing? Is there a discrepancy in figures? Is there a discrepancy in the fact that one says it sold and one said it didn't? In dates? You'll kind of want to know this to build your understanding of things and build your sense of where that market may be when the auction house comes back with some estimates. Look at the particular sales that are comparable to things you want to sell. How many are in the list that have sold? You'll need a free account for many of these places in order to access that information. Were realized prices within an estimate range? Did they include the premiums? How many lots were passed or unsold? That can be for a variety of reasons that something sells for far less than it should have. It could have been perhaps not the right choice of house, not the right choice of location, as in physical location. The house may have made a mistake in its judgment of estimates, or the object may have not been properly identified. Have some questions in mind so that you can compare apples to apples when you're considering what house to use. What's their process? Have they been successful in selling a particular type of object that you're considering putting through? Do they come and examine and make a determination and then come back again? Will they pack and transport? Do you? What are the costs, as Steve had listed? Photography, insurance. Not all houses are alike. Will they keep you in the communication loop throughout the process? What is their seller's premium and commission? Where is your consigned property going to be stored once it's taken by the auction house? Do you learn the estimates ahead? You should, but not always is that the case. And then what happens if your property doesn't sell? So as I said, try to have in mind one or two houses unless you regularly deal with certain ones. But if you're new to the game, try to have one or two houses that you can ask these questions of. And if one house offers a bit of information you hadn't thought of, ask that of the next phone call you make. Once the sale is complete and the check and the documentation have been received, I always suggest a little bit more detail-oriented effort. And all of you who are registrars and collections managers know that's something that we specialize in. Photocopy the check and any documentation from the auction house, especially if your department's not going to have hands-on with that information. Start a master sale file so you can keep that information in it. Copy that same information along with the inventory you prepared and put it in each object file, highlighting what that object is. Because if things get separated later, if your database goes down, you still have a backstop for that information, which might be very necessary in years to come, in decades to come. It might seem redundant, but it's truly an important safeguard. Update your database, keeping any confidential information such as appraisal values, sale information hidden from public access, and try to restrict as much as possible in-house access. Update all of your record-keeping practices, whether you keep a log, a card file, or whatever. And seclude the object files for deaccessioned objects from your permanent collection so that nothing is confusing some point down the road if things are rearranged. And I am speaking from total personal and professional experience here of things that have happened that I have had to then spend time sorting out for no reason when things could have been done just logically in the beginning. And we did talk about public sale being the safest route to sell an object, because then you are being totally transparent. You're more than likely going to get the highest potential value because it is at public auction. And then that way there is a group of individuals who are letting the market decide what the value of the piece is. There are some institutions that want to take the route of a private sale, but unless you are familiar with what that item's fair market value might be, you might be thinking you're taking a good deal when in fact you're not. And there have been instances in cases that I have been on the fringes of where that has been the case. There has been a private sale that was conducted. There was no transparency. The private sale wound up being a very small percentage of what could have been originally achieved. And that then became a little bit of a legal question for the state's attorney general's office, which then wanted to know if they were practicing what was in their collections management policies. Why did they go the private route? Why did they go without any substantiated documentation of what that fair market value was, which would be hiring in an appraiser for at least one unbiased opinion, and then perhaps speaking with an auction house as to what they felt the estimate would be. So a couple miscellaneous mentions. Check your state abandoned property law and always be up to date with that when you're working through deaccessioning and finding things. Be sure you know you have title, as in your institution has absolute title to that property. Be transparent, maintain all records and paper trails. Have your collections management policies reflect your actual policy endeavors. If they don't, why not? Try to stay current by attending conferences, and I know that can be very expensive. So if you have colleagues that you know that are attending a certain conference and maybe there is a deaccessioning panel or other panels you want to keep information abreast of, ask them to share that with you, maybe at lunch or something after the conference. Talk with colleagues. The CCCA is a perfect place to network and discuss those kinds of challenges that we all face here in New England, being so spread apart. And keep abreast of publications, knowing what's happening in the field. So with respect to publications, a few suggested resources for you are one of my colleagues that I go to for deaccessioning issues and has been known as one of the nation's preeminent deaccession specialists is attorney Mark Gold, who is semi-retired now and is in the Berkshires of Massachusetts and is with the firm Smith Green. If you go to www.smithgreen.com and look for Mark Gold under Our Attorneys tab, you will find a very impressive and extensive biography. Mark has contributed to the field in sitting on panels, writing books, writing articles. And if you are in New England and are familiar with the New England Museum Association, on their website, under resources and publications, you will find New England Museums Now and their archives of issues. And Mark has contributed to those issues, and they're listed on his bio on the website. He also in 2021 co-organized the Syracuse University's Deaccessioning After 2020 conference, a 2-day conference, which is important because the pandemic changed many a thing. There is a live hyperlink in his bio that will take you to the page with the YouTube recording links. And just a heads up, the recording comes in the list before the title for that particular session. 3 books that I think you should have on your shelf for a variety of reasons are The Legal Guide for Museum Professionals, edited by Julia Courtney, a former coworker of mine, published by Rowman and Littlefield in 2015. Is It Okay to Sell the Monet? Again, edited by Julia, and again, Rowman and Littlefield, 2018. That's the publication where you'll find my essay on provenance and the retaining of it with objects, and also another article by Mark. And Managing Previously Unmanaged Collections by Angela Kipp, another Rowman and Littlefield publication in 2016, of which I am the ghost editor. And that's really specifically for those of you out there who are maybe coming into a situation where there is no inventory, you're not sure what to do, and all you think of is everything needs to be possibly deaccessioned. So I know I ran through that really fast, but in the interest of time, I wanted to make sure we had at least a few minutes for some questions. And if we run out of time, please feel free to make note of them and join us next week at the Conversations with Colleagues. So I will turn us right back now to Erica and see if we have some questions in our chat.
I have a comment.
Yes.
I'm in Superior, Wisconsin, and we had the 1928 Summer White House for Calvin Coolidge. So I was real intrigued when you were discussing all about Calvin Coolidge.
There you go. You never know what you're going to learn on these webinars.
Yep.
Thank you for sharing that. Erica, what might we have?
We don't currently have any questions in the chat, so I wanted to invite people, folks to unmute and ask a question directly, or of course you can certainly type a question in the chat and then I will read it out to the broader group.
I have a question for Steve about their auction process. My question is, how do you consider monetary return at auction versus the regional value? You know, the organization I'm working with, we are kind of stuck in the middle of that. We have several pieces that have high regional value, but also have a very high national and international collection value. I'm in the Boston area, so Boston made furniture goes globally. You know, we're not just talking about New England. And I was curious as to what anyone's thoughts were on that.
I mean, it's highly subjective. So I don't really, we don't really have a point score around that, and you know, being able to talk to my staff about it, and talk to our collections committee of the board about it as to, you know, what is that value threshold. I think a lot comes down to yeah, how common the item is. You know, if you're going to find it in a couple of other regional institutions, then we feel better about selling it, because if somebody's looking for something like that, you can point them at a place where it's already located. And then, you know, for our organization, I mean, everybody's budgets are you know, very different. But for us, like, if something is going to get $1,000 or more at auction, we will lean towards selling it, because that's real money that we can use towards, you know, building our collection and taking care of our collection. So, you know, there, depending on your budget, your institution and your budget size, you know, a tipping point may just be that, it may be that dollar amount for you, because that's real. And it goes back to why the items are in your collection, you know, in the first place. And you shouldn't feel like you have to defend selling it. If the decision has been made to deassess it, it means it doesn't belong in the collection. You shouldn't really have to defend the fact that you're selling it, because the funds are going back to help with the collection. Not a great answer, because it really is object by object. You know, I'd say if it's Boston furniture, go ahead and sell it, because there's all sorts of Boston furniture museums all over the place. But you know, for what it's worth.
All right, great, thank you.
And I'm sure that you do, but as Steve has just pointed out, that you shouldn't have to defend your reasoning for deaccessioning, but that the reason should be noted in your file as to why you did deaccession. You know, it doesn't match your mission. We have 42,000 others, wasn't in the best condition, and we can't support, you know, maintenance of it as well.
Okay, great.
Ron, I saw that you had a question in the chat with respect to books. Could you unmute yourself and clarify that a little bit, so perhaps one of the three of us could answer for you?
Good afternoon, St. Albans Museum. We're looking over the collection of books that have happened since the museum opened. Many of them are just common, everyday, let's say, New York Life, Life magazine, and things of that nature. And we're looking to basically deaccession those things that have no relevance to our area.
Mhm.
And just wondering if books are handled in any different way.
Well, I'll just interject 2 seconds. If there's things like what you had just mentioned, there are publications that were widely sold all over the place. So
Right.
typically everyone has copies of them. So you could retain a digital copy in case somebody wanted to come to you to do the research there. Although with today's online access, publications of that type can be found anywhere. But no, you know, I would look to, and some of my clients are doing this. They're looking to places outside that might want, for whatever reason, copies of those issues, and just give them away, because again, it's, you know, something that's so widely available at one time, or are saved somewhere in some kind of venue where that is the place where people would go for research. Steve, do you have something else to add to that?
Yeah, a little bit. And so, as I was saying earlier, we have 2 different collections policies, one for our library and archives and the others for our museum objects. It is a goal of ours over the next few years to integrate into one existing policy there. But we do approach, you know, bound printed matter, mass-produced, duplicative items in a different way. And so if it has been added to our library collection, we still deassess it. We still bring it to our collections committee. We still bring it to our board and go through that process. But in that library and archives collections policy, we're a little looser in how we can dispose of those items. You know, I will say, if it's like 19th century volumes, often we'll still send it over to Merrill's for auction, and they'll sell it as a box lot. You know, if it's really just a bunch of very common, you know, stuff, sometimes we'll donate it to a library book sale that's helping a local group. Or at the 4th of July, we sell remainders out of our bookstore in our museum. And, you know, if these things are modern duplicative stuff that's, you know, been dropped off at our doorstep, we'll sell it within that sale. So Ron, we do treat them a little bit differently because of how they're produced and how common they are.
But you do handle them all through the deaccession process, everything.
If they have
is
been
documented in the same way.
Absolutely. I don't think we did in the past, but at least for the past 15 years, if it's got a Vermont Historical Society book plate in it, has been added to our collection, we go through the deaccession process. It's not terribly complicated, you know. We'll just send a list to the board, and they'll give it a good perusal.
Yes, and anything that has been formally deaccessioned into your collection, no matter what it is, has to be formally, anything that has been formally accessioned into your collection needs to be the reverse, formally deaccessioned from the collection, whether that be a plate for the institution or accession number or a tag or a label or something of that nature.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, I think we have time for maybe one more question. We do have one in the chat, but I wanted to invite anyone to pose a live question as well. Any takers for that?
I have one. So I'm just curious, Steve, you brought up navigating politics. My name is Martha Cummings. I'm the executive director of the New Hampshire Boat Museum in Wolfboro. And a number of years ago, the board and previous director accepted an object into our collection that we just we're not a large institution, and we just are having a really difficult time trying to care for it. It's an object that fits our mission, but we don't have a place to really care for it. And if we create something, we would have to build a shelter over this particular boat. It's a one-off. It was a local person's hobby boat that they built, as a mini scale model of a boat that everyone in this area would know. So I feel like I'm navigating a political minefield just within my board. Every time it comes up, I just kind of cringe like at a board meeting, because most of my board members are like, oh my gosh, like, can we just do something with this thing? And other board members are like, no, we must save it at all costs. And, you know, like, we have deaccessioned it out of our collection, but it's sort of in this holding pattern right now. Like, we know we can't care for it at the level that the collection needs it to be cared for. And I don't know. I'm just feeling quite stumped with this. And what do we do? You know, if I put it out to public auction, are we just gonna get slammed?
I'm sorry to hear that. It sounds like a conundrum. I mean, it's interesting that the board has deassessed it, but doesn't want to get rid of it. You know, that's a hard part in maybe trying to figure out, not for this object, but going forward policy on that. So like with our policy, if the board deassesses it, they've done it. It is now the purview of the executive director to dispose of it. And they can't say, no, you can't get rid of it, because they voted to get rid of it. And by deassessing it, it's in essence saying that the museum is not going to put any effort into this object. So, you know, there's some interesting pieces within your board. I can't answer that because that's politics.
Yeah, no, of course,
boards. Is it possible to give them a price too? Like the group that says, oh, we need to take care of it at any cost, do a good faith effort as what would an enclosure cost to house this boat?
Hundreds of thousands of dollars.
But I think present that to them. You know, this, yes, we want to keep it. If we want to keep it, the board needs to vote that they're going to raise this money to build this structure. Is this what you want to do with your money or your fundraising activities? Maybe they'll say yes. That's always the problem. But you know, if they see a big number, I can't imagine. You know, my board would probably say, "Oh, no way." You know, on the other hand, is it worth a public sale if everyone's going to be up in arms, or is there another institution that would take it, or does it become a children's playground behind the school, or you know,
Thank you.
Martha, I have a question. So you said that it's already been formally deaccessioned from your collection, right? But it's just kind of hanging out on premises?
It's not on premise. It's stored offsite.
Okay, so the need would be to build some type of enclosure for it. Not only that, but there's also then who's going to maintain it if it's, you know, not part of your permanent collection, which means your responsibility, and it's being deaccessioned and it's kind of like hanging out there somewhere. Not only does it need to have shelter, it needs to have maintenance. So as Steve suggested, and I agree, you know, come write up a proposal and say, okay, those of you who say, nope, can't get rid of it at all costs, this is what it's going to cost. X amount for the shelter, X amount for an annual maintenance, and X amount for, you know, staff to then take care of it, or hire in a professional to take care of it, and then see where that conversation goes.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Absolutely. I know we've had some people leave. Erica, is there any burning question in the chat that we might want to take a quick moment to answer?
Well, we do have a question in the chat, but I think it will engender a longer conversation. So I suggest that we hold it till next week's follow-up session.
Okay, very
and
good.
that'd be a good time to unpack more thorny questions like Martha's as well, if there are any others that occur to you. So yeah, Darlene, do you want to wrap us up?
I will, yes. So I want to thank you all for joining us this afternoon. And please remember that we have Conversation with Colleagues next Wednesday at 12 noon. We'll have Matt, Steve, Rejoice, and myself, and several of us from the board joining in. And please, you know, bring your questions. Now that you've had all of this information shared with you, you're going to need time to sort through. You've seen Matt's Deaccessioning 101 webinar. If you have questions of him with respect to that or how he is handling things, extended from the copy of notes that he had given me, or anything else that comes up, please join us next week because we want to be sure that we answer your questions and help you work through the process. So thank you all for joining us again, and look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you.